you know there's been a concerted effort in the world to get people to have less children? Do you know how successful they have been? Do you know what, in America, if you go back just 100 years, do you know what the average number of children per family was? It was like 5 or 7, somewhere in that area, 5 to 7, depending on how far back you go. Do you know what the average is today? 1.3 or 4. Yeah, 1.2. That's the average today. Do you know there were men who intentionally, in these different think tanks that are around the world, globalist think tanks and think tanks in America, that sat down to try to figure out how to get people to stop having children, and they came up with different plans to do so? One of those guys is the guy that I cannot stand, and I do not like anybody that gives this guy any kind of credit at all, was Henry Kissinger. That was an evil man. Henry Kissinger was an evil man. He was almost single-handedly responsible for the one-child policy in China. When China started off and Nixon went over to China because of Henry Kissinger, they opened the door in China and began to work with China. China at that time did not have a one-child policy, and they were opposed to it. And Henry Kissinger and the men in power talked China into a one-child policy. And they can do that in China because guess what China is? It's a communist nation. But we're not a communist nation in America. So how do you get Americans get down to one child? You've got to convince them to engage in lifestyles where they believe a child is a what? A punishment on their life. And they literally discussed this. You know, one of the things they discussed in these think tanks was one of the things they came up with was to reduce the number of children being born, was to push homosexuality upon Americans. They actually discussed that. And said, if we do this, more people engage in homosexuality, less children there will be. Less children will be born. Promiscuity was another one that they did, to try to get people engaged in sex outside of marriage and get people to get involved and believe marriage was an institution that was old-fashioned, outdated. See, these things didn't just happen in our culture. They were planned in our culture. And they were planned to try to reduce the amount of children being born because these people were all about control. And you'll hear it. If you go to the UN, they got it, UN 2021, UN 2030 agenda. You'll see this word in there all the time, sustainability. Do you know one of the major points under sustainability is? Reduce population. Reduce the population. And there has been a major movement in the world to reduce population by getting people in free countries to have less children, and in countries that aren't free, just restricting them outright. But my Bible says, happy is the man who hath his quiver full. But if I get so caught up in this world system and hitting all the things of this world, guess what I might think a child is? They're a burden. Because I can't have my new bass boat. By the way, I'm saying a bass boat for a reason. Because I like bass fishing. And I'd love to have a bass boat. But I'm going to tell you one thing I'd never do. I would never trade one of my children for a bass boat. But there are people that will have limited amount of kids so they can have more things. Bigger houses, nicer things, and they can have a much more free lifestyle. And the reason that's true is because they've been convinced in their hearts by a world system, because they lack understanding that having children is some sort of burden or some sort of punishment, as opposed to it being a heritage from the Lord and a reward and being happy to have your quiver full of them. I think if America ever truly gets back to God like they should, guess what they'll start doing again? Well, they'll start doing exactly what God commanded them to do in Genesis chapter 1. What did God command to do in Genesis chapter 1, 26 and 27? Be fruitful and what? Did God ever rescind that command? Did God say, oh, it's the New Testament now and you don't have to be fruitful and multiply any longer? God never said that, did he? No. God said, be fruitful and multiply.